How you doing? Devin Scott, guy with opinions and a bunch of things to say for no good reason. Either way, so I'd like to um, touch on a concept that I work around a lot. So I love philosophy, I love psychology, I love the study of mythology, of religion, I love studying artificial intelligence, I love studying kind of the theories of consciousness like phi ratios and everything, and I um, just that stuff is huge to me because it all of it makes me ask pretty much the same question no matter what, and it's what is an identity? I really like talking about identity. It makes me so happy because it's a question, that well applies to everybody who has a self, and it has so many different answers, so many different types of considerations. So I play with it a few different ways, and it's a very common phrase. Everyone knows the phrase ego. Sigmund Freud, you know, famously used it in very specific ways. You have id, ego, superego. You know, you have famous art pieces et in Arcadia ego. Um, the phrase is ancient. It just simply means I. But I like to use it in a certain way. I like to imagine that the ego is an apparatus, is an object, either solid, physical, material, or conceptual, and this object is specifically defined because in order to talk about it, I guess you have to define where identity ends and begins. Is an ego is any apparatus whose designated or self-identified function, purpose, or primary activity cannot be done unto itself. And this was first off a fairly arbitrary way for me to describe what something is, and I found that it was actually a really useful concept. For example, you can use a telescope to look at things. However, a telescope can't look at itself. So the telescope begins and ends at the part of which everything is absolutely necessary for a telescope to look at other things, specifically faraway things, and that's everything that is in the telescope, and everything that you exclude from it really begins at the point where it can't perform that function on itself. You can't use a telescope to look at itself. Similarly, a pencil can be used to write on things, but a pencil can't write on itself. Now you're probably saying, well, what if I attached a mirror to this telescope, and now I have a mirror on the telescope, and now it's a new object? Or what if I have a bendy pencil I can bend around in itself? Well, those are different objects. Now it's no longer a pencil, it's now a new entity called a bendy pencil, or another species of apparatus called a mirror telescope. And even still, that bendy pencil can write on itself, but that's now its new identified function. It's now a thing that is supposed to be able to write on itself, so it has a new identity and therefore a new sense of ego. However, though it can write on itself, it can't write on itself on itself. You've now given it a new boundary of self-identification. This is important to me because I like to think, well, what am I? Who am I? Now, if you've had a chance to see the video or everything I've ever said on the concept of frames of ethics and different areas of complexity of ethics, this is important because your sense of being and your sense of identity is often conflated with your state, right? If you are there's a cool phrase by the rapper Cannabis that says, "Rock bottom turns human being to beast. Why the hell do you think we got canine teeth?" I love that phrase because it makes me think about how a situation can cause you to act or identify in a different way. Lots of things would bring it to the same premise. You can read, for instance, Marcus Aurelius, who, to me very famously talked about how his influences allowed him to become the philosopher he was, and if he fell into the hands of a sophist, he'd be a completely different type of entity, that he understands that his environment is part of what formed his sense of identity, his sense of values. So, to me, I like to look at these different things. Now, obviously, as a human being, I have several apparatuses in my body. Like my heart is a thing, so does my heart have its own ego. My body itself, the physical frame, my bones, my brain, these are all fun things. And now you start thinking about apps on the phone, which is a very common kind of analogy. So then you are, like the telescope with a mirror on it, a new creature or an individual creature, an entity formed out of many other apparatuses that have their own functions, in which I call this an aggregate ego. And this aggregate ego has a series of its own agendas, right? Based off of its function, the way they identify, the way they work in their environment. So my body has an agenda, my brain has an agenda. More conceptually speaking, my mind has an agenda, and my mind itself is an aggregate ego. It has a sense of, it's maintaining my parasympathetic nervous system, and it's handling my metacognition, and these different firings off, these different areas of sense and experience and consciousness are all working in concert along with my body and along with different nodes of nerves, and it's a complex system. So if it's that complex and you have this sense of aggregate ego, where is myself in there? And that's where we get into identity. I choose at any given point in time to identify with any one or group of these egoic apparatuses. We're just going to go with apparatuses for the rest of this video. And, the question goes to, again, when I start thinking about my primary function, my primary doing, as I identify with it, what do I most want to identify with? This goes back to this frames of ethics. What's my highest ethical obligation, my motivation, and where do I find in me an egoic apparatus that serves that need? So that's really important to me, because being human, the experience of humanity is messy. There's so much going in there. Like, I would love to do some things, but those things, no matter how big, like I'd love to rebuild cities and gather information and build giant robots, because who doesn't really kind of want to build a giant robot? But things get in the way of that, like the desire to eat food, sometimes bad food, the apparent need to sleep, the bathroom, smelling bad and taking showers. You see, these things are fairly basic, but they're just at the core of my most physical apparatus, egoic apparatus. Then you have other things like emotional concerns. You have different areas between the physiological and the psychological. So how do you take care of these things? Now, I've also mentioned in my concept of second nature and Edenism that in a more ideal world, we've created a complexity of order to cater to these things. Imagine being in a garden where you always had food that was bloomed, and maybe it's got little robots that polish and peel your fruit for you. I'm not necessarily sure I'd want that, but it would be a hella nice convenience to have access to. So I start looking at another concept called alter ego, which is, again, it's a phrase, but I co-opted, made it my own thing. It's now my phrase in the context of this conversation. An alter ego is something that you can create that serves the same purpose of the original egoic apparatus, like my body or something else, but it essentially becomes kind of a sacrificial lamb, becomes a martyr, and takes the role so that you can go on doing other things. And this isn't something I completely made up, like, just out of nowhere. It's kind of something I identified, because we do this all the time. Whenever you hire someone, like, if you hire someone to do a job for you, you've created this sense of alter ego. That's why when a coach wins a game, even though he may never have played the game, he didn't shoot a single basket, that coach will identify with being a winner of that game. His part in the team as kind of a leader of a secondary apparatus that's full of other apparatuses, which are the players. His identity within that body, he won the game. That's what a coach does. So whenever you have a chance to put a team or a machine or something in your way, which is what we do with technology all the time anyway, you create this type of alter ego, something you still identify with, but not necessarily identify as. And so when you allow yourself to identify with your body, but not as your body, you play a fun psychological trick where you can get it to do things or stave off doing other things, because you sense a type of higher sense of being. I don't even say higher. I don't want to say like the mind is definitely a higher sense of being to the body, because my mind ain't doing a lot if my body shuts down. So let's not say higher, but let's just say offset sense of identity. And with technology, we do this whenever you have an app or service that might do searching for you. Google does this. You can say, I want to be alerted anytime X happens on the internet. So instead of having to scroll through news feeds or any type of wall of feeds or data, instead you've created an alter ego that has adopted a part of your inherited will, and it does something for you. Now, sometimes it can be very, very bad. I think I've gone on and on about how much my feelings on recommender engines and on notification systems that get abused for the sake of shoving ads at us or any other honest but still questionable reason. So how can we use alter egos in technology to do us better, right? Like, for instance, and I always talk about this, the idea of just being fed whenever your stomach was about to growl. That's kind of a nifty ideal world for me. If a drone just kind of stopped by and dropped off a banana every time I was going to be hungry, or just brought me a bag of Chinese food, that would be pretty prime to me. When the moment my super Fitbit or my smartphone noticed I was about to be hungry, or my glycemic level was beginning to drop, or my energy activity patterns were beginning to offset before they were supposed to in the time of day, boom, magical food delivered to me, and I say, well, thanks, right? That's that kind of sense of alter ego where I give my body-mind system freedom to just continue doing what it's doing, because I no longer need to suddenly become hungry and feel a craving for carbohydrates and go searching for food. That's proper use of this alter ego to me is not only important because of the technological and civilization implications, but because when you think about the idea of identifying with these technologies, you start being a little bit more engaged with the creativity of them. Because if you're going to create something that is doing something on your behalf, that's now your will propagating throughout the many wires and tubes and satellite dishes of the internet in general. That is your will. It's not just part of a system that's separate from you. You might create or program or inform a piece of software or a driver or a device to do something that you may have directly or indirectly told it to. And that sense of ownership, when you adopt the alter ego concept, is really great for designing better digital systems. At least I feel it is, because it keeps me from doing a lot of really bad, questionable things. I often say that almost anybody who can develop software could be a millionaire overnight. It's probably usually ethics that keeps them from making the thing that would bring them loads of money, but at the risk of propagating something questionable into an app store until it got figured out and removed once the implications of what unsafe design can do. So how could you utilize the concept of an alter ego, a thing that you identify with and propagates a portion of your will to do work in order to design a better system for yourself or for other people? How would you, as a consumer, request an alter ego type piece of software or device to be made by developers, by entrepreneurs, by the industrial technological complex in general? How would you ask for that and inform it? What features did you want to see? I think these are the important questions that we should ask as both consumers and developers, and I actually think it's something that I would love to hear you tell me. What's your opinion on that? What values would you want to see digitized and institutionalized and made into a type of protocol policy in this future that we're creating at this very moment? So let me know. I'd love to hear about it, and I'm going to be out.